Welcome to the lab, everyone. I'm Jonathan Benyon with the Institute of Human Anatomy, and today we're diving into questions that have sparked curiosity, diets, debates, and have nearly started multiple dietary civil wars. How many carbs do you really need? Or could you completely live without them? I mean, think about it. Could you completely ditch bread, pasta, fruit, and even ice cream? And not only survive, but actually thrive and exercise and perform on no carbs or something like a ketogenic diet? Or are carbs an absolute must for our bodies to function? So in this video, we're going to unpack the science behind this by discussing if there are certain cells that absolutely need carbs, what really happens when your body goes into ketosis, and show you how your brain might surprise you with its adaptability. So let's get into this anatomical and physiological awesomeness. So let's start with, could you live without eating any carbs whatsoever? And to answer this question, it would help to know if there are any cells throughout the body that can only run on carbohydrates for energy. Because if there are, wouldn't that mean we need to be eating carbohydrates? Well, let's find out. As far as if there are any cells in the body that can only run on carbohydrates, the answer to that is yes. Red blood cells, for example, can only utilize carbohydrates in order to make their ATP. And there's a very important reason for this. The main job of red blood cells is to transport oxygen. Pretty much every characteristic of these incredible cells is to make them more efficient oxygen carriers. Their biconcave shape creates greater surface area for more efficient oxygen diffusion. Even the thinness of red blood cells facilitates more rapid diffusion of oxygen between the exterior and the innermost regions of the cell. And here's the main reason why red blood cells can only utilize carbs. Mature red blood cells do not have a nucleus and also lack many other organelles, including mitochondria. And this is so all of their internal space can be freed up to pack in as much oxygen as possible. And since they do not have mitochondria, that means red blood cells cannot make ATP aerobically because mitochondria require oxygen in order to make that ATP. Now, you may remember from a previous biology class that the mitochondria can utilize carbohydrates to make ATP, but mitochondria can also utilize fats to make their ATP. Even amino acids from proteins can be converted and funneled into the mitochondria to make ATP if necessary. But again, the mitochondria requires oxygen regardless if it's using carbs, fats, or amino acids. And so if a red blood cell doesn't have mitochondria, it cannot utilize an alternative energy source such as fats or amino acids to make ATP. It has to use carbohydrates through the process known as anaerobic glycolysis. Now, you may also remember from a previous biology class that anaerobic glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose without oxygen in order to make a net of 2 ATP molecules. And because the red blood cells don't have a whole bunch of other organelles, they don't have to waste any ATP on any of those other extra structures. Plus, it kind of makes sense, right? The whole job of the red blood cell is to carry oxygen. So we wouldn't want the red blood cell to be stealing from the oxygen that it's carrying to the other tissues. I mean, could you imagine a red blood cell goes through the lung, picks up all this oxygen, and then as it's traveling through the circulation, it's gobbling up all the oxygen it's supposed to be delivering to, say, like a foot muscle? And then it gets there and the foot muscle's like, dude, where's my oxygen? And the red blood cell's like, I ate some. Now, beyond that being a really weird imaginary scenario of cells and muscles talking to each other, that would obviously defeat the whole purpose of red blood cells. And luckily that does not occur because our red blood cells don't take from any of the oxygen that they are carrying. And again, make their ATP through breaking down the carbohydrate glucose without oxygen. Now, there are also other cells throughout the body that almost exclusively rely on carbohydrates as their energy source, such as the neurons of the brain. And much of the literature will say that the brain needs about 120 to 140 grams of glucose per day. Now, there is some debate on those exact numbers, some citing lower numbers, but the important point for our discussion is that the brain prefers glucose as its energy source. However, we are going to find that the brain has the ability to adapt to a lower amount of glucose. But why can't the brain use something like fat in the form of fatty acids to make its ATP? Because the brain does require a significant amount of oxygen for its energy needs, and the neurons of the brain definitely have mitochondria. So you might think, well, if the neurons of the brain have mitochondria, they should also be able to utilize fat. Well, let's talk about some important differences between glucose versus fat metabolism and transport. Earlier I mentioned when there is no oxygen available, you can utilize anaerobic glycolysis, which again was breaking down glucose in the absence of oxygen, and that yielded a net of 2 ATP molecules. However, when oxygen is present, an end product of glycolysis called pyruvate can be funneled into the mitochondria, and this will net over 30 ATP molecules. I say over 30 because depending on the cell, some will make low 30s, some can get into the mid 30s, but the important point here is that without oxygen, we get only 2 ATPs from glucose. But with oxygen, we get over 30 ATP molecules from glucose. That's a big difference. But if you funnel fatty acids into the mitochondria, you can make up to 113 ATP molecules. So again, you might be thinking, well, the brain should totally use fatty acids if you can make that much more ATP. However, there are always trade-offs in the land of biology. Yes, you make more ATP with fatty acids than you can with glucose. However, it requires much more oxygen and many more enzymes and many more chemical steps. In other words, it takes a lot more oxygen and time to metabolize those fatty acids than it does to metabolize glucose. And your neurons don't want to wait around. Neurons are sending action potentials or electrical signals at an incredibly fast rate, and therefore need to use and replenish ATP very quickly. And the glucose provides those 30 ATP molecules much more quickly than even the higher amount of ATP that could be provided from those fatty acids. There's also a transportation issue. Glucose travels through the blood-brain barrier much more quickly and efficiently than fatty acids do. So that also creates an additional bottleneck for the neurons of the brain to utilize fatty acids. Also, breaking down fatty acids for energy tends to create more oxidative stress than breaking down glucose because it requires more oxygen. Oxidative stress comes from the generation of free radicals, and the brain is less resilient than other tissues are to oxidative stress. So yet another reason why the brain prefers glucose. So clearly our bodies are fascinating, down to our very DNA. And that's why I'm excited to partner with MyHeritage. MyHeritage is a leading global family history and DNA service that makes exploring your genetic roots super easy. And I recently took one of their DNA tests. The process is simple. They send you a kit, you swab both cheeks, ship it back to them, and in a few weeks you get your results. And MyHeritage covers more regions than any other test, with a detailed ethnicity estimate across 42 ethnicities and over 2,100 geographic regions. Plus, DNA matches to find relatives based on shared DNA. Now, this was my first ever DNA test, so I had no idea what to expect. I do know that 2 brothers immigrated from England to the US generations ago, and my family supposedly spawned from one of those brothers, so I'm excited to find out if this is accurate. So let's take a look at my DNA results. Jonathan, ready to explore your ethnicity? Well, I most certainly am. Here it comes. 49.3% English, which pretty much confirms that I'm from one of those 2 brothers. And 28.5% Scottish. I really hope that means I'm a descendant of William Wallace. 8.7% Danish. And it also looks like I've got some Dutch in me. And then there's 8.4% of 4 more ethnicities. I wonder what those are. And I can find that out over in the full ethnicity estimate. And it gives you those smaller percentages. I've got some French, Irish, Norwegian, and then it shows you geographically where you hail from genetically, which is super cool. And then, what is this? Ancient origins? Yes, please. I have 41% of European hunter-gatherer in me. So if you're curious about your own DNA story, MyHeritage has a promotion right now. So click the link in the description box or scan the QR code on screen. And use the coupon code ANATOMY to get a 10% discount when ordering the kit. And as an added bonus, you can start a 30-day free trial of MyHeritage's best subscription for family history research. And now, let's get back to the science of carbs. And so based on everything we just learned about the brain preferring glucose and the red blood cells completely relying on glucose to generate ATP, you might say, okay, then yeah, we need some amount of carbohydrates in our diet in order to fuel the brain and the red blood cells. But that's still not technically true. Your body has the ability to create its own glucose from other substances. The liver, for example, can convert fats and proteins into glucose through a process called gluconeogenesis. Even the kidneys are capable of gluconeogenesis. And from a survival standpoint, this makes perfect sense. If a human being goes without food for an extended period of time, and therefore no carbohydrates, or if a human gets very small and limited amounts of carbohydrates, such as certain populations of people that historically lived in very cold climates and could only mostly rely on eating meats, the body needed a fail-safe mechanism to create enough carbohydrates for the cells that needed them, like those red blood cells and even the brain to a certain extent. And gluconeogenesis can make about 180 to 220 grams of glucose per day. And this is enough to meet the baseline glucose needs for the body. And so this finally does answer one of our questions. You can technically live without eating any carbohydrates. But is this ideal? Especially if we aren't just talking about survival here, and say someone wants to thrive or even exercise and expend much more energy. Is a low-carb diet sufficient enough? Well, it can be. And this is where we get into ketogenic diets and ketosis. So let's discuss what happens with ketogenic diets and even discuss some potential limitations. When a person drastically reduces their amount of carbohydrate intake, the body will obviously start to create some of its own glucose through gluconeogenesis. But again, that can only produce a limited amount. And since we are talking about more than just simply surviving, the brain may actually need more energy for someone who's constantly engaging their brain through various daily activities. And maybe this person is also wanting to exercise on top of that, which would obviously increase the metabolic requirements of muscles and other tissues, but this would also further increase the metabolic requirements of the brain. And so in these situations, because the brain can't efficiently metabolize fatty acids, the body will produce other substances that the brain can utilize for energy. And those are known as ketone bodies. Ketone bodies, ironically enough, are derived from fatty acids. The liver will take fatty acids and convert them into these ketone bodies. And the two main ketone bodies are acetoacetate and beta-hydroxybutyrate, which I'll just continue to refer to as ketone bodies. Now, these ketone bodies can pass through the blood-brain barrier and be taken up by neurons and then funneled into the mitochondria to generate ATP. And for you physiology nerds out there, once they are funneled in, they get converted to acetyl-CoA, which goes into the Krebs cycle to start this formation of ATP. And the longer someone goes with a limited amount of carbohydrates in their diet, the brain will adapt and start to utilize a higher percentage of ketone bodies for its energy needs. For example, during the first 12 to 24 hours of fasting or restricted carb intake, ketone body production increases. But glucose still remains the primary fuel for the brain, with ketone bodies supplying about 5 to 20% of the brain's energy needs. However, after 3 to 4 days, blood ketone levels rise significantly as the person starts to enter a state of ketosis, and ketone bodies can provide about 30 to 50% of the brain's energy. And in prolonged carbohydrate restriction of about 1 to 2 weeks or more, ketone bodies become the dominant energy source of the brain, contributing to 60 to 70% of the brain's energy needs, with the remainder being supplied by glucose derived from gluconeogenesis and or any small amount of carbohydrates the person is still eating. Now, other cells can also utilize ketone bodies to make ATP, such as skeletal muscles, especially those slow twitch and intermediate muscle fibers. But skeletal muscle fibers can also utilize fatty acids and amino acids when necessary. But this does show you how people meet their energy needs when they're utilizing a ketogenic diet. And you can kind of think of ketone bodies as somewhat of a glucose replacement. And there are plenty of people who've done well on ketogenic diets. They felt better and they've lost weight because the main principle of getting on a ketogenic diet is to restrict carbohydrate intake. And if you watch part 1 of this video series, it wasn't that carbohydrates are inherently bad. The main problem is that it is so easy to eat them in excess in our society, especially in the form of added sugar. And so someone eating a ketogenic diet is obviously not going to be getting that excess sugar, and therefore overall calories typically go down and weight loss follows. But there still are limitations to this ketogenic diet for certain people, specifically for certain athletes or people that participate in certain sports and exercises. One of the first limitations is, if you remember, we mentioned that glucose, when utilized with oxygen in the mitochondria, one glucose molecule could produce over 30 ATP molecules. However, one ketone body can produce just over 20 ATP molecules. So we're getting less ATP with a ketone body than you would with glucose. Something else to consider is that you cannot store ketone bodies in your muscles like you can glucose, because we can store about 400 grams of glucose in the form of glycogen within our skeletal muscles, and an additional 90 to 100 grams within the liver. And this storage is going to be even more important in certain situations of prolonged high-intensity exercise. And the last thing we need to consider with ketone bodies is that they cannot be utilized anaerobically. Remember, if we don't have enough oxygen present in a cell, like a skeletal muscle fiber, we can use glucose in anaerobic glycolysis and make 2 ATP molecules. But again, ketone bodies cannot be utilized in this way. So what situations would this create a problem for? Well, we do need to understand that people that train and exercise on ketogenic diets can adapt quite a bit to get most of their ATP produced in their muscles from the metabolism of fatty acids and even ketone bodies. And obviously their brains are going to primarily run off of those ketone bodies. But if you continue to increase the exercise intensity, say during some exercise session, some of your muscle fibers will eventually be forced to cross over to utilizing anaerobic glycolysis because you cannot supply them with enough oxygen fast enough when you get to a certain level of exercise intensity. And some of the fast twitch muscle fibers that start to get recruited during those high levels of intensity, they primarily run off of anaerobic glycolysis. Now, some of you on a ketogenic diet might be thinking, I've done high intensity exercise and I still feel like I've had the energy to complete those tasks. And I'm not disputing that because you were still using glucose to accomplish those high intensity bouts of exercise. But remember, that glucose was likely just coming from the glucose that was produced by the liver through gluconeogenesis. And because you're in ketosis, your brain is using more ketone bodies than glucose. And so that extra glucose that is no longer being utilized by the brain can now be used to provide some glycogen storage in the muscles and eventually be utilized by that muscle during high intensity exercise. Plus, most people on a ketogenic diet still eat some amount of carbohydrates, which would also contribute to some glycogen storage. But here's where it becomes more of an issue during more prolonged high intensity exercise sessions. Like, I probably wouldn't do well on a strict ketogenic diet. I play basketball for 2 hours, 1 to 2 times during the weekdays, and then every Saturday we go for 3 hours. And since certain aspects of basketball require anaerobic glycolysis, I might be fine during the first hour if I were on a ketogenic diet, but as I get into that second and even third hour, I'm likely going to drain my limited glycogen stores and would have a harder time kicking it into those higher intensity bursts that are required throughout a basketball game. But because I'm not on a ketogenic diet, I started the basketball session with more glycogen in my muscles, and I'll even sometimes eat a banana or a carbohydrate source halfway through that longer session that I do on Saturdays. But what about a long distance runner? Now, again, people on ketogenic diets can adapt quite a bit to utilize fats at higher intensities than the average person. But again, let's say that person that was running a marathon hardly took in any carbohydrates with their diet and also chose not to refuel with carbohydrates throughout the race. Come mile 23 or 24, when this person may want to make a hard push to maybe overtake some of their opponents, this individual is much more likely to hit a wall because they've already burned through their limited glycogen stores earlier in the race. Now, obviously, for someone who isn't doing a lot of prolonged high-intensity exercises or playing an anaerobically based sport, this person probably wouldn't run into any of these problems. However, someone who wants to do a ketogenic diet but still wants to participate in these types of exercises, this individual could do some experimentation and could incrementally add a few additional carbs to their diet until getting to that point where the individual no longer feels like they're hitting that wall during those higher intensity exercise sessions. These extra carbs could be added daily as an overall weekly average, or they could be strategically added on days that will include those longer, higher intensity exercise sessions. So finally, back to the question, how many carbs do you really need? Well, by now, I think you see that it really depends. It depends on your goals, it depends on exercise choices and intensity, but there is some data specifically for exercisers and athletes that gives daily carbohydrate recommendations for those that want to avoid running out of energy for their sport or exercise of choice. And these numbers assume one is not overeating fats and has adequate protein intake. And these numbers would be for those that are not looking to do a ketogenic diet, because when people on a ketogenic diet see these numbers on screen, their external anal sphincters will likely contract a little bit more forcefully. And so again, those on ketogenic diets that find themselves hitting the wall during some of their higher intensity exercise sessions, they could start with what I mentioned earlier by adding a few more carbohydrates incrementally. Thank you so much for watching part 2 of our little carbohydrate video series. If you missed part 1, we'll link that here. And thank you so much for watching and supporting our channel. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below, and we'll see you in the next video.